Well, hello and welcome to another crafty video. This is Jennifer McGuire and I'm very thankful you've stopped by. So today I plan to do a fun and easy partial die cutting technique for you. But once I got started, I decided to also have fun playing with some Holtz Distress Oxide Sprays. Been getting a lot of questions about these, and we're just going to do some quick backgrounds today, along with the partial die cutting. And I will have a more complete Distress Oxide Spray video coming out later on. This is just a little preview. We're going to start with doing those fun backgrounds, and then we'll move on to doing the easy partial die cutting technique, along with these fun stamped images. Okay, so these are Holtz Distress Oxide Sprays. This is a fusion of dye and pigment ink that creates these oxidized effects when you add water on top. Because it has a pigment property to it, you can actually use it on darker colors of paper. Now I'm going to do a few different examples. My first ones will be on white watercolor paper, but we'll do darker paper in a moment. I really like how you can spray this and very quickly get this really misty looking background. That just is something that you could use for a subtle background if you use lighter colors, or you can use it for a playful background. You could use darker colors to create a galaxy sky. There you can see how with a few quick sprays, you get a really fun background. But the best part about this is I think that leftover that you see there on my glass work surface. I just take another piece of the watercolor paper and just press it directly into that excess ink. And the fun thing about this is because it has that pigment property, the colors kind of build on each other instead of just mixing and becoming a new color. So what I like to do is just press it on there, heat set it, then add some more for that layering look. And then we can also add water to this afterwards to get that oxidized look. By heat setting in between each layer, you really build that color up and it gives the look of dimension. So let's look at these completed. This one is the one where I just sprayed it on. I love that background. So fast and easy to do. And then here's the one where I built all the layers up. Now that it's dry, I can add even more layers. There I went in with the Squeeze Lemonade Distress Oxide Spray and added some little drops here and there of the yellow. If you press firmly on the nozzle, it sprays. If you press softly, then you get more of like a spritz, like little droplets. And you can also take the top off of your oxide spray and just tap bigger droplets on from the little tube that goes down into the product. Now, by the way, I forgot to mention that you want to make sure you shake these very well before using them and work in a ventilated space. Okay, so there we have lots of layering going on. I'm going to go ahead and heat set that once again so it kind of holds those colors where they are. Now this didn't take long to create and I could leave it as is, but I wanted to add some stars to this, just a little more interest, and I did so with this star stencil that is part of a Holtz STAMPtember bundle, and I'll show you the stamp set that's in that bundle too a little bit later. I love this star stencil, and so what I'm doing is adding Hero Art's Unicorn White Pigment Ink with an ink blending tool, and I'm putting that generously over the stencil. And check out those soft stars that you get. I could have sprayed water over my stencil or do other things to add to the effect, but I thought the white would be nice, it would be soft, and I could get some crisp outline edges to my stars. And here's a closer look at that final background. So much going on in it. I used unique colors, but you definitely could do a galaxy sky like this if you wanted. Okay, here's another example. This one has some greens and blues to it. Again, I pulled this one together very quickly. I'm starting with watercolor paper and just spraying on a few different colors of Distress Oxide Spray. Now I didn't end up using these first sprayed backgrounds. I saved them for another project that I'll share later. But I like how you can quickly get that misty looking background just by spraying those colors on. And then you have all of your extra ink on your work surface that you can use on another project. As I mentioned, I work on the Holtz glass media mat, which I love, but you could work on a craft sheet here if you want to instead. But by working on something with a smooth surface, you can save all that extra ink for these additional pieces. Now, so far I don't have much variation in color on that background because all the colors that I used were very close to each other. So I decided to spray some water on that just to get a little oxidation going. I'll show more about that later. And then I sprayed some Blueprint Sketch Oxide Spray on top of that. So the fun thing about using these is you can get some really bold backgrounds by using very different colors, or you can get something a little more subtle like I have here. Okay, next I'm going to use that same stencil again with Hero Arts white pigment ink. Any white pigment ink would work here. Putting it generously over that stencil. And then when I remove it, we'll have these very subtle stars that have a nice definition to the edges. So now you can add whatever you want to this. You could splatter water onto it to get that oxidized look. You can build more layers, but I decided to leave these as is. I will explore some of the other fun things you can do with these in a future video, but I did want to share a few more things in this one. And you can use Distress Oxide ink pads and inking tools to create backgrounds like this, but the sprays are easy and you can paint with them and do many other things. Now this time I'm going to use the Distress Oxide sprays to create a background, and then I'll add Distress ink to it too. So here I have white watercolor paper and I'm spraying it generously with different colors of the oxide sprays. Now in this case I could leave this background as is, but what I'm going to do is dry it now that I've got a bunch of color on it. And then I'm going to pick it up and dab it into that excess ink that's on my work surface. This will quickly build those layers of color on our background. Okay, so I'm going to flick on some purple so I can get some droplets. And then I'm going to spray some water on it. And I'm not pressing the nozzle down completely, just a little bit so I get those splotches of water. And wherever that water hits that Distress Oxide ink, you'll get like this oxidation look. I decided to go ahead and keep adding more on top of this. I wanted a lot of color on this. And check out how it all starts to build up. I'm going to freeze this here, but you can see how you can keep adding layers. And because there's that opaque property to these inks, you can get that layered look without it ending up just being a solid color when you mix all this together. Now I still have a lot on my desk here, so I grabbed another piece of paper and I'm just going to pick up a bunch of color on here. I'm going to add water to that, which gets that oxidized look going where it kind of turns white. And then I can add more color to my background. So a little goes a long way with these inks. You can create many backgrounds just from a few sprays. You can keep adding water to keep it moving around. But all in all, I think they're really fun to work with. I have used sprays in the past that are translucent, and I always had trouble with them just kind of mixing and becoming muddy. So it's fun to use something where you can layer things together. I also think it's fun to add their regular Distress ink on top of some of your layers that you create with your Distress Oxide sprays, and then splatter it with water. And it's really fun to see the different looks you get from this. The Distress ink lightens wherever you put that water, and the sprayed background around the edges kind of gets this white oxidized look. So you can keep building this up. You really can't go wrong with it. Okay, so now I'm going to make the edges a little bit darker. That's just the look I wanted for this card. So I'm coming in with an ink blending tool and some chipped sapphire ink, Distress ink. You could definitely use Distress Oxide inks in this case. And then I thought it'd be fun to add that bit of stencil with the white ink. So I'm just building up layers, but all of these are really quick to make. And because a little ink goes a long way, if you're working on a surface like I am, you can make lots of backgrounds at once. Okay, so here is the final result. I like how adding the ink with your ink blending tool makes this look like an inked background, but really use those sprays to speed up the process and add lots of color. Okay, now this one is my favorite of all of them. In this case, I started out with black cardstock. So this is Hero Arts Pitch Black Cardstock. And check out how vibrant the oxide sprays are on a dark color cardstock because it has that opaque property to them. I haven't found any other sprays that allow you to do this, and I love that look. So now you could leave this as is, but you know me, I like to add a little more here and there. So I dried that, and now I'm coming in with some Distress ink in the chipped sapphire color, and just adding a little bit of dark around the edges. I will say it's really fun to experiment with mixing these different products together to get different looks. Okay, now bring on that stencil. I'm using that again with the white pigment ink. And because pigment ink is opaque, that white will sit on top of the background and stand out and give you a really nice soft look. Okay, now this time I wanted to add some shimmer. So this is a spray bottle filled with water and about a half a teaspoon of Perfect Pearl pigment powders. Now I just put some in there and I shake it and then I use it as a spray. In this case, I decided to just kind of flick some of that shimmery water onto my project. That causes that little bit of oxidation, and then it also leaves those little shimmer dots behind. Once I was done with that, I also used my Blueprint Sketch Blue Oxide Spray to put a little flicks here and there of dots of bright blue color. And here's a closer look at that final result. You have a little bit of shimmer from that Perfect Pearl water that I created. You got a little oxidation from the water. You got the blue droplets, the white stars. It really creates a fun background very quickly. Okay, now that I have a bunch of backgrounds created, let's go ahead and do our partial die cutting technique. Now for this, I used some really fun and playful stamps from Tim Holtz. This is the Tim Holtz STAMPtember 2019 stamp set, and it comes along with that star stencil that I used earlier. These are cling stamps, and cling rubber stamps stamp so nice. There are a lot of details to these Halloween images, so the fact that it's cling means you don't have to worry about it. It'll stamp perfect every time, and you get nice, crisp results. Now I'm using my scissors to cut the sentiment off the bottom of my images. You don't have to do that, but for today's card options, I found that was helpful. Let's start with this one where I do partial die cutting around our stamped image. See how there is the die cut rectangle with the little cross stitch, little X's, the faux cross stitching. I did it so that I die cut around the image but didn't cut through the image, and it's all one layer piece. So I'm stamping my image onto white cardstock, being sure to have plenty of extra room around it for our die cutting. I'll be using the Lawn Fawn cross stitch dies. This is a great die set that cuts little X's around the inside of the cutting edge. I'm taking one of the smaller ones and lining it up right next to our stamped image. Notice that it overlaps with our stamped image. You want to make sure it overlaps. Then I'll put some tape to hold it in place. Now when I go through my die cut machine with this, I don't want to cut it as I normally do because it would cut right through our image. So we'll do partial die cutting. So to do this, I'm taking my top cutting plate and only having over most of my die, but not all of it. Notice that the edge of the top cutting plate is right up against the edge of our stamped image, where we want the die cutting to stop, so it's lined up right there. That way anything under the cutting plate to the left will cut. Anything hanging out to the right will not cut. So we won't cut through our stamped image, just up to it. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like when you run it through. You can do this with any die cut machine you have. I just find that the Platinum is really easy to use. And there you can see our die cutting right up to the stamped image. Now I want to die cut again to have the die cutting to the right of our image. So I'm lining up the die with the die cutting we've already done. And this time I'll do partial die cutting on the other side. And anything under my cutting plate will cut. So I'm putting the edge of the cutting plate right up against the edge of our stamped image. I'll run that through, and this will cut to the right side of our stamped image. So now we have this long piece that is this rectangle, this long rectangle with little X's, and we have a stamped image on it that it doesn't cut through. Now you could totally die cut a piece and then cut out your little image and glue it on top, but I love this one continuous looking piece. I think it's such a cool look and a great way to keep your focus on your image. I decided not to color these images. They have so much detail, I thought they looked best in black and white. So after I cut around all of the image hanging off of our die cut, we have our one piece. So now I'm going to put this into my stamping tool and stamp the sentiment. Remember, I had cut the sentiment off to be able to do this, but you definitely could do masking instead to keep the image connected. Okay, so now that I have my sentiment in place, I have one of the backgrounds that I created earlier. This is the one where I started with white and put lots of blues and purples on there and some Distress ink too. Trim that down and put it onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. Now I'm going to use my trimmer to cut a little bit off the right edge of this, and then we will add that onto our card with foam tape. Okay, I wanted to add a little sparkle to the background of this one, and I didn't do it earlier, so all I'm going to do is draw little dots in the background with my Stardust glitter pen. It gives the look of the splatter, but you have a little more control over it, and it's something that you can do as an afterthought. And this really catches the eye very nicely, just adding those little dots of sparkle in the background. There's a closer look at that background that we created. And by doing this partial die cut technique, we have a simple element to put on this card. This is a great design. Anytime you want to experiment with some fun backgrounds, just do a simple partial die cut image to put on top. Okay, let's do some more die cutting. In this case, I wanted a narrow rectangle with our image kind of on the bottom right. Now, I didn't have a narrow rectangle die, so we're going to take this bigger, wider one, and we'll change it up with partial die cutting. So I'm going to position this right over our stamped image, and we're going to first die cut the left edge, so right by his nose. So I'm overlapping with our stamped image. Remember, we'll do partial die cutting, so we won't cut through that. Put some tape on that, and now I'm going to put under my cutting plate the areas that I want to cut, which right now is just going to be to the left of our image. So see how I'm putting right up against the stamped image, the edge of the cutting plate, and the edge of my die on the left is under the cutting plate. So only that left edge of my die is going to cut when we run this through. So I'll run that through the die cut machine. It always pops through, but I've never had a problem with that. And there we have our first die cut side. And notice it makes the corner right by his nose, and so you have a perfect die cut shape on that side. Now we have to do the other side. So I'll take the die and I'm going to line it up so that it goes right through our stamped image again, but makes a narrow rectangle. So the die is hanging off of our piece over on the left. Put some tape on that to hold in place, which I think is really important to do because you want to make sure that it doesn't shift. And then I'm going to do partial die cutting on this edge. So anything under the cutting plate will cut. So I'm putting the edge of the cutting plate right up against the edge of our stamped image up there on the top. And then we will run that through. This will cut the other side of our die cut. And again, it won't cut through our stamped image because we're doing partial die cutting. Okay, so now we have a narrow rectangle. I'm just going to trim off the excess at the top since I plan to make this kind of come out of the top of our card. And then I'll just use my scissors to cut around the stamped image. And by the way, these new Tim Holtz scissors are fantastic for fussy cutting. I highly recommend them. They cut a nice sharp outline. I love them. Okay, so once I have that cut, it's time to stamp our sentiment on there also, which again I had cut off from the main image just so I could change up the design a bit. This time, instead of adding sparkle to the background, I decided to add some black gems onto our white die cut piece. I just thought those little dots kind of went along with the dots of the stamped image and filled up some of the space on that white die cut. So again, this is a very simple design that allows that image to be the focus and then shows a lot of that colorful background that we made. Okay, now on to my favorite of the examples. This is the one that we created on black cardstock. So you just had to add a few spritzes of the Distress Oxide Spray and you get this really cool background. Well, on this one, I'm going to do partial die cutting with a circle die. So this is a circle die with faux stitching on the inside edge. I'm going to line it up to overlap with our stamped image and then again hold it in place with pieces of tape. Now this shows you can use a lot of different shapes. Rectangles and circles are definitely the best, but I'll show you another option on my next card. So I'm putting the edge of the cutting plate right lined up with the edges of our stamped image up here on the tail and on the ear. Anything under the cutting plate will cut, so we'll run that through. And it won't cut through our stamped image, but instead cut right up to it. So now we have this one continuous piece and it looks so cool. I then can trim around the little stamped image, again using some sharp scissors to do that quick fussy cutting. And by the way, this is a great way to have kind of a cutout look, but not have to take the time to cut out the whole image. I'm really only having to fussy cut half of it. Next, I wanted to stamp the sentiment on this. I had cut the sentiment off the main image, and I'm going to cut it again, and so that my sentiment can be stacked instead of a line. And I know people worry about cutting up their stamps, but you can always put them back how they were originally intended, and this gives you a lot of flexibility to change up your card design. Okay, so once I have that stamped, it's time to assemble our card. I did decide to add little white dots in the background with a white gel pen. It just kind of added a little pop in the background, I guess. And I did add some iridescent gemstones so that it would catch the light. I liked this background on the dark cardstock so much that I plan to do a video that will focus on all the different things that you can do on dark colors with the oxide sprays. You can paint with them and do many other things. Okay, my last card example uses the first background we made in this video, and I did partial die cutting with a heart die. Now this shows that you can use pretty much any shape, but we're going to have to do a little trick with this one. So I'm taping my heart die down so that it overlaps with our stamped image. This time we're going to have to do partial die cutting in 2 steps. It's just because of the shape of the die. The first time I'm lining my cutting plate up with the bottom of that bottle image up there on the top. So it's lining up there, and it'll cut everything under the cutting plate. Now my second time through, we're going to cut the rest of the heart that meets up with the top of our bottle. So here, let me flip that over. You can see how half of the heart is cut, but now we need to cut the rest of it. So again, I'm going to set up my plates so that the edge of the cutting plate meets up with the other edge of our stamped image. So you see how it meets up down there? So now I can run it through again, and it cuts that bump on the heart over there on the left. So sometimes you might have to do your partial die cutting in 2 steps, but you usually should be able to come up with a way to do this technique with just about any die. Okay, so now I can fussy cut around our little bottle here, which is very easy to do. And we have a fun I love you image. I really love how playful these are. Okay, so I went ahead and stamped love you next to this using the other part of the image that I had cut off, and then added it onto our card with foam tape. I also glued a few iridescent gemstones scattered along the background, just so that when you tilted it in the light, it would add that bit of sparkle. So here you can see the partial die cut piece that we created with a heart die that actually had some faux piercing on the inside edge. And it creates that one smooth piece that you can add to this fun background. Okay, so there you have a really easy partial die cut technique, along with a little introduction into the Distress Oxide sprays, which I'll share more about in the future. All of these supplies are linked below in my YouTube description. There are a couple other videos in the middle here that you might like. I thank you for stopping by today. I hope you'll return again soon and have a wonderful week.